Welcome to Her Secret Truth, a place where the truth always comes out. Here you'll hear stories of family betrayals, hidden secrets, and shocking revelations. Every story is a step closer to the truth someone tried to hide. Subscribe to Her Secret Truth so you don't miss new stories you won't be able to stop watching. My grandson yelled at me, telling me that I had to apologize to his dog right now or get out of his house. I stood up and stared straight into his eyes. He smirked like he had already won. I said only 3 words and left. 2 weeks later, he was banging on my door desperate. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far it has reached. I never thought my own grandson would choose a dog over me. The October afternoon sun streamed through Carlos's floor-to-ceiling windows as I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to his downtown apartment. At 66, those steps weren't getting any easier, but I had made this journey every other Sunday for the past 2 years. It was our tradition, or at least it used to be. I knocked softly on the heavy wooden door, already hearing Buster's high-pitched barking from inside. That little white Maltese had more energy than a toddler and about as much sense. The door swung open and there stood Carlos, my 22-year-old grandson, looking annoyed before he even properly saw me. He greeted me in a flat, distracted tone and stepped aside to let me in, but I could tell his heart wasn't really in it. I said hello warmly and kissed his cheek, noticing how he barely bent down anymore. I asked how his week had been, and he answered that it had been busy, that work had been crazy, and then walked toward the kitchen, leaving me standing in the entryway like a stranger. The apartment always made me feel out of place. Everything was modern but cold. Gray walls, black furniture, strange light fixtures, and not a single family photo anywhere. The only warmth came from that little dog, who was spinning in circles on the white couch. I told him I had brought the chocolate chip cookies he used to love, the ones with pecans. He barely glanced at them and told me to just put them on the counter. I set the tin down carefully, trying not to let his indifference sting. This wasn't the same boy who used to run to my house every day after school, who begged me to teach him how to bake, who called me his best friend. That boy had disappeared somewhere along the way, replaced by someone distant who treated me like an obligation. Buster jumped down from the couch and came over to me. I had always been good with animals, so I reached down to pet him. But as I shifted my weight, my foot accidentally touched his tiny paw. The dog let out a yelp and moved back, more surprised than hurt. What happened next will stay in my memory forever. Carlos suddenly shouted, his voice full of anger, asking what I had done. I looked up, startled by the fury on his face. I tried to explain that it had been an accident, but he interrupted me and said I needed to apologize to Buster right now. At first I thought I misunderstood, so I asked him again. Instead of calming down, he got even more upset, rushed over, picked up the dog and held it like it was injured, saying I had stepped on him and that he could have been seriously hurt. I told him again it was an accident, that I barely touched the dog. He said it didn't matter and repeated that I needed to apologize or leave his house. The words hit me like a slap across the face. I stood there thinking about everything I had done for him over the years, and now he was demanding I apologize to a dog. I asked him calmly if he really expected me to apologize to a dog. He said yes, that Buster was family to him. He started to say something more but stopped. Still, I understood what he meant. I looked at my grandson and wondered when he had become this person, and when I had become so disposable to him. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. The dog had already calmed down and was wagging its tail again, completely unaware of everything. Carlos stood there stubborn. I could have argued. I could have reminded him of everything I had done. I could have pointed out how unfair it was. But I didn't. Instead, I reached for my purse. I adjusted the strap over my shoulder and looked at him one last time. Those eyes that used to light up when he saw me now felt distant. I said quietly that I understood perfectly. As I turned toward the door, he tried to say something, but I stopped him and told him there was no need to explain. He asked again if I was going to apologize to the dog. I paused with my hand on the doorknob, but I didn't turn around. I said goodbye and left. But as I stood in that elevator, going down and leaving behind the grandson who had just chosen a dog over his own grandmother, I realized something that should have been clear many years ago. Carlos had become exactly what his parents had raised him to be. To him, Isabella, reliable, always available Grandma Isabella, would always be there. ready to accept whatever small pieces of attention he gave and still be grateful, as if that was all she deserved. To him, my value was only in what I could give. The elevator doors opened into the lobby, and I stepped outside into the cool October air. My small sedan was parked in the visitor space, the same place I had used dozens of times before. But this time felt different. Felt like the last time. As I drove back to my modest duplex across town, I kept thinking about the envelope in my bedroom closet, the one I had been keeping for 3 years, waiting for the right moment. The one that could change everything for Carlos, if he only knew what was inside. But today Carlos had already made his choice. He had shown me exactly where I stood in his priorities, and it was somewhere below a spoiled Maltese that spent most of its time sleeping on expensive furniture. I parked in my driveway and sat there for a moment, watching the wind move the first fallen leaves across my small front yard. In 2 weeks, Carlos would come looking for me. Not because he missed me and not because he understood what he had done. He would come because he would finally learn what was in that envelope and he would need me. But by then it might already be too late for apologies, even the ones meant for people. After that Sunday, the silence in my house felt different. The next morning, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had already gone cold, staring at the empty chair across from me. That was where Carlos used to sit during our weekend visits, back when he was small enough to need a booster seat, back when spending time with Grandma Isabella was the best part of his week. The tin of chocolate chip cookies sat unopened on the counter, a quiet reminder of what had happened the day before. I had spent 3 hours making them, using the same recipe I had followed since he was 5 years old, the same one his mother, Elena, once called too fattening when Carlos turned 12, around the time she decided I was becoming too involved in her son's life. I should have noticed the signs back then, but like most grandmothers, I believed that love would be enough. My phone buzzed on the table. A message from Elena appeared. She wrote that Carlos's mother had called and said I upset him, and maybe it was time to give him space to grow. I stared at the message, feeling that familiar tightness in my chest. Elena had never really called me Mom. It was always Isabella, or sometimes simply Carlos's grandmother. But she would use Mom when she wanted something, when she was trying to influence me. I deleted the message without replying. The truth was, I had been giving Carlos space for years already. Every time Elena said I was interfering, every time Mateo mentioned boundaries, I stepped back. I watched from the side as they filled Carlos's life with expensive things, teaching him that love had a price, and that people could be replaced once they were no longer useful. Still, I stayed quiet. I kept playing the role of the grateful grandmother, accepting whatever small attention they chose to give. I walked into my bedroom, opened the closet, and moved aside the winter coats I rarely wore. Behind them was a small fireproof safe, the kind you could buy in any office supply store. Inside that safe, along with my personal documents, was an envelope that had been waiting for 3 years. I took it out with slightly trembling hands. It was thick, cream-colored, with my name written on it in my brother Jorge's careful handwriting. Jorge had passed away at 78, leaving no wife, no children, and a fortune no one had expected from someone who lived so modestly. He had always been the quiet one in the family, working as a bookkeeper for 40 years and living in the same small house our father had left him. What none of us knew, not even me until the lawyer contacted me, was that Jorge had been investing every extra dollar for decades. He had bought IBM stock back in 1962. He had invested in properties in areas everyone else ignored. He lived on $20,000 a year while his investments grew beyond anything we imagined. $2,400,000. All of it left to Carlos, but with one important condition. I was the one responsible for managing the inheritance until Carlos turned 25. Jorge had been very clear about this. He had watched Carlos grow up, seen how Elena and Mateo raised him, and he worried about what would happen if that kind of money ended up in the wrong hands too soon. In his letter, Jorge had written that Isabella was the only one in the family with sense, and that she would know when the boy was ready, if he was ready at all. For 3 years I had kept this secret. Through Carlos's college graduation, through his first job, through all those family gatherings where Elena would make subtle remarks about my limited finances. I had watched them struggle with credit card debt, while I was sitting on something that could completely change Carlos's life. But Jorge had been careful. The inheritance was not simple. Carlos could not just spend it on cars or vacations. The money was structured to be released in stages, with the largest part, $1,800,000, available only if Carlos could prove financial responsibility and respect for family values by the age of 25. And I was the only one who could decide if he had met those conditions. Yesterday, when Carlos demanded that I apologize to a dog, I understood something that should have been clear long ago. The boy Jorge had worried about, the one who needed time to grow up, had not matured at all. If anything, he had become worse. The sound of the kitchen timer brought me back to reality. I had put a pot roast in the slow cooker that morning, more out of habit than hunger. Carlos used to ask me to make that dish every time he came over, saying it was better than anything from a restaurant while helping himself to more. Now I was cooking only for myself the way I had been for months. I placed the envelope back into the safe, but something made me stop. Next to Jorge's letter was another document I had almost forgotten about. The power of attorney he had insisted I sign before he passed away. It gave me access to a safety deposit box at First National Bank, one I had never opened. Jorge had once said it was just in case, that there might come a time when I would need more than just words to make people listen. At the time, I did not understand what he meant. But sitting there in my quiet kitchen, where Carlos's laughter used to fill the space, I began to wonder if my brother had seen something I had missed. The afternoon passed slowly, filled with silence. No calls from Carlos, no unexpected visits, no conversations about his week. Just quiet and the weight of decisions I was not ready to make. Jorge's words kept returning to me. She will know when the boy is ready, if he is ready. For the first time in 3 years, I started to feel that the word, if, carried more meaning than I had wanted to admit. Then my phone rang, breaking the silence. The number was unfamiliar, but something about it felt familiar. A man introduced himself as Ethan Hayes from Hayes, Keller and Associates, the firm that had handled my brother's estate. I asked if something was wrong, but he said it was not exactly a problem, only that there had been inquiries about the estate. Someone had been asking detailed questions about the inheritance. When I asked who, he explained that the inquiries came from Mateo Navarro, who claimed he was doing financial planning for the family and was especially interested in the timeline and conditions of the inheritance. Mateo, Carlos's father, a man who had barely shown any interest in Jorge while he was alive, and now suddenly wanted information about his money. I asked what he had been told, and the lawyer assured me that nothing had been shared because of confidentiality. However, he mentioned that Mateo seemed to already know details about the amount, which suggested that someone close had revealed information they should not have. After the call ended, I sat there holding the phone, as everything started to make sense. Mateo's sudden interest. Elena's message about giving Carlos space. The way Carlos had been treating me lately, like I was no longer important. They knew. Somehow they had found out about the inheritance, and now they were trying to influence Carlos and push me out so they could control the situation themselves. The irony was almost perfect. They had no idea that I was the one thing standing between Carlos and that money. They were trying to remove the very person their plan depended on. I walked over to the window and looked out at my small garden. The roses Jorge had helped me plant 5 years ago were still blooming, even in the October chill. He had known this day would come. He had prepared for it in ways I was only now beginning to understand. I quietly said that he had always been the smart one. The next day, I decided I would go to First National Bank. It was time to see what else he had left in that safety deposit box. Something told me I would need every advantage I could get. Because if Elena and Mateo believed they could use their son to push me aside and take control of Jorge's fortune, they were about to realize how wrong they were. To them, I might have been just a grandmother, easy to ignore and take for granted. But I was also Jorge's sister, and he had trusted me with more than they could imagine. Soon they would understand that their biggest mistake was not underestimating me. It was teaching their son to do the same. 2 weeks passed in complete silence. No calls, no messages, no unexpected visits. For the first time in years, I was living for myself. I had gone to First National Bank 3 days after that Sunday, and what I found in Jorge's safety deposit box had shocked me. There were not only documents about the inheritance, but also detailed notes, records of conversations Jorge had witnessed between Elena, Mateo, and Carlos over the past 5 years. My brother had been documenting everything. Notes about how they spoke about my mental state, about how they planned to slowly reduce my role in Carlos's life so it would be easier when I became a burden. Jorge had seen everything. And he had prepared. What I had not expected was that Carlos would learn about the inheritance so quickly. One evening, the pounding on my door started suddenly. It was not a polite knock, not even the doorbell. It sounded like someone was trying to break the door down. I set my tea aside and walked slowly to the window, looking through the blinds. Carlos's car was in my driveway, parked at an angle like he had arrived in a hurry. The knocking continued, and now I could hear his voice calling out that he knew I was inside. He said he needed to talk to me. I considered ignoring him. Part of me wanted to let him stand there and feel what it was like to be dismissed, to have his needs considered unimportant. But curiosity won. I opened the door, and the sight in front of me was not what I expected. Carlos looked like he hadn't slept in days. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled. Dark circles were under his eyes, and his hands were actually shaking. He called me Grandma, and his voice cracked like he was 12 years old again, saying he was glad I answered. I stood in the doorway, not moving aside to let him in. I asked what brought him there. He asked if he could come in, saying he needed to talk about something important. I asked mildly if Buster was with him. He blinked confused, then said the dog was at home. After a moment, he understood and looked ashamed. He mentioned that day, the day I left. I said I remembered it clearly. His face crumpled, and he admitted he had been wrong. He asked again to come in, saying he only needed 5 minutes. Against my better judgment, I stepped aside. He moved inside quickly, clearly relieved. We sat in my living room, the same room where he had spent countless afternoons as a child. Now he sat on the edge of the sofa, tense. He said he had found something about Uncle Jorge. I kept my expression neutral. He pulled out his phone, his hand still trembling slightly, and said a lawyer had called him the day before, someone named Hayes, saying there were documents about an inheritance. I asked what he told him. He said he thought it was a scam at first, but when my name was mentioned he started to believe it was real. Then he looked at me closely and asked if I had known all along. I folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. He said Uncle Jorge had left him money, a lot of money, $2,400,000. He said it quietly, like saying it too loud might make it disappear. I asked if that was what the lawyer told him. He said yes, and that he needed to meet with me to discuss the terms. He asked about the conditions, saying I was the one who would decide everything. He leaned forward and asked what he needed to do. I studied his face, seeing traces of the little boy he used to be, but also something else. Something that confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't here because he missed me. He wasn't here because he regretted choosing a dog over his grandmother. He was here because he wanted something from me. I asked him to tell me about the last 2 weeks. He blinked, confused by the question. I repeated it, asking what he had been thinking about since the day he told me to leave. He shifted uncomfortably and said he had been busy with work, that Buster had to go to the vet. Then he admitted he had been thinking about the inheritance, at least since the lawyer called. He said that if it was real, if Uncle Jorge had really left him that kind of money, then everything would change. His silence was answer enough. I stood up slowly, feeling every one of my 66 years. I asked if he knew what Jorge's conditions were. He shook his head eagerly. I told him they were financial responsibility and respect for family values. I explained that Jorge had been worried about him, that he had seen how his parents raised him, how he treated the people who loved him, and that he was concerned about what would happen if he received a large inheritance without earning it. Carlos's face went pale. He asked what that really meant. I walked to the mantel where Jorge's photo stood next to pictures of Carlos as a child. In one of them, Jorge was teaching 7-year-old Carlos how to fish, both of them smiling. I told him that his uncle understood that money without character was dangerous, and he wanted to make sure Carlos learned to value the right things before receiving his life's work. Carlos insisted that he had learned those things. He said he had a good job, paid his bills, and was responsible. I turned back to him and reminded him of what happened 2 weeks ago. I told him that he demanded I apologize to his dog or leave his home, choosing the comfort of a pet over the dignity of the woman who raised him. I asked what kind of family values that showed. The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again, unable to answer. He said it had been different, that he had a bad day and that the dog meant a lot to him. I asked quietly if I meant anything to him. The question hung in the air between us. He looked at me differently then, really seeing me for the first time. Not as an obstacle to his inheritance, but as a person whose feelings mattered. He said that I did matter to him. I asked if that was true because his actions suggested otherwise. He buried his face in his hands and said he had made a mistake. He apologized and admitted that his parents had been influencing him, telling him I was becoming a burden. I asked what exactly they had been saying. He said they told him I was becoming needy, that I was trying to control his life by making him feel guilty, and that it would be better if he created distance. That word boundaries came up again, the same word Elena always used when she wanted to cut me out of something. And I asked him directly if he had believed them. He admitted that he had wanted to believe them, his voice breaking. It had been easier than admitting he was selfish, easier than accepting that he had taken me for granted. Carlos slid off the couch and dropped to his knees beside my chair, looking up at me with the same expression he had as a 5-year-old when he broke my favorite vase. He asked me to give him another chance, saying he knew he did not deserve it, but he wanted to prove he had learned and would do anything. I looked down at this young man, my own blood, who had once been the center of my world. The boy I had loved without conditions, who had still managed to break my heart with such careless cruelty. I told him there was something else he needed to understand about the inheritance. He immediately reacted, asking what it was. I explained that the conditions were not only about proving himself to Jorge, but also about proving himself to me. I made it clear that I was the one who would decide if he was ready for that responsibility. Me, the grandmother he had dismissed, the woman he had chosen a dog over. That was when the reality truly hit him. I could see it in his eyes, the understanding that his future now depended on the person he had treated the worst. He asked what he could do, how he could fix everything. I stood up slowly and told him that was something he would have to figure out himself. I gave him only one hint, that it was not about what he could do for me, but about who he chose to become. I walked toward the door and he rushed after me, asking if that was all, if I was not going to give him a list or explain what Jorge wanted. I opened the door, letting the cool evening air in, and told him that Jorge had trusted me to know when he was ready. Right now he was not even close. He stood there in the doorway, lost and frightened, and asked how much time he had. I told him he would turn 25 in 18 months, and that was when Jorge intended for most of the inheritance to be released. He repeated the number quietly, realizing what it meant. 18 months to prove he understood what family truly meant, 18 months to show he deserved that trust. I paused and told him that Jorge had believed he had the potential to be a good man, but potential alone was not enough. He had to choose to become that person. As Carlos walked back to his car, his shoulders lowered, I watched him from the doorway. He sat there for several minutes with his head in his hands before finally starting the engine. I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of everything I now held. $2,400,000 were at stake, but more importantly, so was Carlos's character. Jorge had been right to worry. Carlos still had a long way to go. But for the first time in years I had seen something different, a crack in the confidence and entitlement his parents had built around him. A glimpse of someone uncertain, even afraid. Whether that would turn into real change I did not know. But I had 18 months to find out. The phone began ringing early in the morning. I was already awake, sitting at my kitchen table with coffee, watching the sunrise over my small garden. I had expected this call ever since Carlos left my house 3 days earlier, looking like someone who had just realized his future depended on the person he had wronged. The screen showed Elena's number. I let it ring, stopped, then started again. This continued for about 10 minutes before I finally answered. I greeted her calmly. Her voice was sharp, without the usual forced politeness she used when she wanted something. She said we needed to talk. I asked if we really did. She told me not to play games and said Carlos had told them about the inheritance and the conditions. I took a sip of coffee and asked what exactly Carlos had told her. She said that I was somehow in control of whether he received the money, that I would decide if he was worthy. I confirmed that Jorge had left clear instructions. She said it was ridiculous that Carlos was his only nephew and the money should go to him automatically. I asked calmly why. That question seemed to catch her off guard. She said that was simply how inheritance worked, that family money should go to family. I asked how much time she and Mateo had spent with Jorge while he was alive. How many visits, how many calls? There was silence. They had treated Jorge the same way they later taught Carlos to treat me, as someone whose value only mattered after death. She tried to say it was different, but her voice lacked certainty. I asked if it really was. I reminded her that Jorge had been family too, and asked where they had been when he was in the hospital for 3 days before he died. She said they had been busy. I pointed out that they were no longer too busy now that money was involved. The silence that followed was full of anger. Then she said that she and Mateo were coming over and would arrive in 1 hour. I said I would make more coffee and ended the call. They arrived in 58 minutes. Elena walked up to my house with determination, while Mateo followed behind more quietly. Through the window I saw Carlos sitting in the car waiting outside. I opened the door before they knocked. I invited them in calmly. Elena walked past me into the living room, her heels clicking against the floor. She was dressed for battle, power suit, hair pulled back severely, makeup applied like war paint. Mateo followed more slowly, nodding at me with the awkward politeness of a man who knew he was about to watch his wife make a scene. She told me to sit down, as if she were in her own home instead of mine. I remained standing. I said I preferred to stand. She crossed her arms and said we should cut through the pleasantries, asking if I was holding Carlos's inheritance hostage just to make him jump through hoops. I said I was honoring Jorge's wishes. She said Jorge was dead and could not control people anymore. I replied that he still could. That is how wills work. Mateo cleared his throat and suggested we discuss this reasonably, asking what Carlos needed to do to meet Jorge's conditions. I turned to him and said Jorge wanted Carlos to demonstrate financial responsibility and respect for family values. He said those were reasonable criteria. Carlos has a good job. He pays his bills. I asked if that was really true. I said that, according to my sources, Carlos had been supplementing his income with loans from them that were never repaid. She said it was none of my business. I answered that it became my business when it involved Jorge's money, and asked how much Carlos had borrowed in the past year. Mateo shifted uncomfortably and did not answer. I said the number myself, $12,000 in loans for things that were not necessary. The color drained from their faces. I continued, saying I also knew about their $35,000 in credit card debt, about loans taken using Carlos's credit, and about how they had been telling him I was becoming a burden. She accused me of spying. I said I had simply been watching my family the way Jorge taught me to. I walked to the mantel and picked up the photo of Jorge teaching Carlos to fish. I said Jorge was not just worried about Carlos's character, but also about their influence on him, and that he kept very detailed notes. Mateo stood up and asked what kind of notes. I said they described conversations about their plans for Carlos's future, including removing me from his life. She went pale. I said Jorge had heard everything, how they called me senile, how they said I was manipulative, how they told Carlos to establish boundaries. I reminded her that I had raised her son while she focused on her career. She sat down, the fight leaving her. I added that Jorge had also heard their plans for the inheritance, how they wanted to control it and benefit from it. Mateo said they loved Carlos and wanted what was best for him. I said that from where I stood it looked like they wanted what was best for their bank account. I placed the photo back and turned to face them. I said Jorge knew that if Carlos inherited $2,400,000 immediately, he would never learn the value of work, the importance of family, or the difference between people who love him and people who love his money. He would become exactly what they had been training him to be. She said I could not decide whether Carlos deserved his inheritance. Jorge left that money to him. I said Jorge left that money to the man Carlos could become. Whether he becomes that man is up to him. And yes, I was the one who decides. That realization hit them both. For 22 years, they had seen me as the convenient grandmother. Now they realized I held their son's financial future in my hands. Mateo asked quietly what I wanted. I said I wanted nothing. But Jorge wanted Carlos to learn respect, responsibility, and genuine care for family. I looked out the window where Carlos still sat in their car, his head in his hands. I said that right now Carlos was panicking because he realized he treated his grandmother badly, and that it might cost him money. That was not remorse. That was calculation. Until he can feel real regret for hurting someone he loves regardless of money, he is not ready. She said this was extortion. I said it was accountability. Matteo moved toward the door, pulling her with him. At the door, Elena turned back to me, her eyes bright with unshed tears of rage and frustration. She said I might think I had won something, but families are complicated and people make mistakes, and that did not mean Carlos did not deserve his inheritance. I told her she was right. I said that families are complicated, but love should not be. And until Carlos understands the difference between loving someone and using someone, Jorge's money stays exactly where it is. They left without another word, Elena slamming my front door hard enough to make the windows shake. Through the blinds, I watched them argue in the driveway. Then Carlos got out of the car, and the three of them continued in low, tense voices. Eventually they drove away, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the weight of what I now controlled. I poured myself another cup of coffee and sat at my kitchen table. Outside, the morning sun disappeared behind heavy clouds, and the first drops of rain began to fall. For 22 years, I had been the family member who absorbed everything, the criticism, the excuses, the expectations, and still loved them without question. I had been the safety net they never acknowledged but always relied on. Now, for the first time, they needed something from me that I could refuse to give. The irony was clear. In trying to push me out of Carlos's life, they had revealed that I was the most important part of it. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It was Carlos. He said his mother had taken his phone, but he borrowed one, and he asked if we could talk. He said he was starting to understand what I meant, and that he wanted to try to earn another chance. I stared at the message for a long time before deleting it. Understanding was only the first step. Now he had to prove that he could change, not because of money, but because he wanted to become a better person. And that would take more than a message. 3 months passed before I heard from Carlos again. I had expected him to return quickly, with promises and dramatic attempts to fix everything. I also expected his parents to interfere in some way. But there was only silence. At first, I wondered if they had found a way around Jorge's conditions. I called Ethan Hayes, and he assured me the will could not be challenged. Without my approval, Carlos would receive nothing, and any attempt to interfere would send everything to charity. So I waited. I took care of my garden and continued my quiet routine, not knowing if Carlos had given up or if something had changed. The answer came on a Thursday afternoon in January, with a soft knock on my door. Not the desperate pounding from 3 months ago, but something calm and respectful. I opened the door and saw Carlos standing there. He looked different. He had lost weight, his clothes were simpler, and the expression in his eyes had changed. The arrogance was gone. In its place there was something I had not seen in years. Humility. He greeted me quietly and asked if I had time to talk. I studied his face, looking for signs of the same calculation I had seen before. Instead, I saw tiredness, uncertainty, and something that looked like real sadness. I let him in. We sat in the living room, but this time he did not sit on the edge like he was about to leave. He settled into the sofa and looked around the room with quiet recognition. He said he remembered building forts there, using my blankets, even when his mother complained. I told him he had never ruined anything, that he had always been careful. He nodded, then took a breath and said he needed to tell me what the last 3 months had been like. I told him to go on. He said the first thing I should know was that he had not spoken to his parents since that day. After they left my house, they spent the entire drive telling him how to manipulate me into giving him the inheritance. I asked what they suggested. He said they wanted him to pretend to be sick to make me feel guilty. When he refused, his father suggested threatening to cut contact with me completely. He said he refused that too. His voice stayed calm, but I could see how much it affected him. He said his mother called him naive and said I was just trying to feel important, and that if he played along, he would get the money and return to his life. I asked what he told them. He said that if that was how they saw me, the person who raised him, then he did not want their advice anymore. He leaned forward and told me he had moved out of his apartment. That surprised me. I asked why. He said because he realized he could not truly afford it. He had been living beyond his means, depending on his parents, never learning how to manage money properly. He gave a small, honest smile and admitted that it was hard to prove responsibility when he had never actually been responsible. I asked where he was living now. He said he had a small studio apartment across town. It was nothing fancy, but the rent was $600 a month, and he could actually afford it on his salary. I felt a flicker of something that might have been pride, but I kept my expression neutral. I asked about Buster. Carlos's face fell. He said he had to give him up. The new apartment did not allow pets, and even if it did, he realized he had gotten Buster for the wrong reasons. He said he was not ready to take care of another living being when he could not even take care of himself properly. That admission hit me harder than I expected. That little dog had been the reason for everything between us, but hearing that Carlos had given him up showed a level of awareness I had not expected. I asked what happened to him. He said he found him a good home with a retired couple who had a big yard and plenty of time. They even sent him pictures sometimes. He said Buster was happy. Carlos showed me a photo of Buster playing in a large backyard with an elderly man. The dog looked content and carefree. I said that must have been difficult for him. He said it was, but it was the right thing to do. He admitted he got Buster because he was lonely, but he had been trying to fill that loneliness with something that required more responsibility than he was ready for. He added that it was similar to how he had been treating his relationships with people. That surprised me. I asked how. Carlos paused, choosing his words carefully. He said he realized he had been treating everyone in his life like they existed to make him feel better about himself. He said I was supposed to be the grandmother who made him feel loved and special. His parents were supposed to make his life easier. Even his friends were chosen because they made him feel important. Now, he said he was trying to understand who he was without constant validation. He admitted it was harder than he expected. I leaned forward slightly and asked what he had discovered. He said he did not really know himself. For 22 years, he had defined himself by what others gave him or did for him. He said he had been the grandson I spoiled, the son his parents invested in, the friend who paid for everything. But when all of that was removed, he was not sure what was left. I asked if that was why he stayed away for 3 months. He said partly, but also because he knew that if he came back too soon, it would only be another form of manipulation. He said he would be coming back because he wanted something, not because he had changed. Carlos looked at me directly and said he wanted to be honest. He said he still wanted the inheritance and would be lying if he said otherwise. He said that kind of money would change his life in ways he could not even imagine. I appreciated the honesty, even if it confirmed my concerns. But then he said something else. He said he did not want the money if getting it meant becoming the kind of person who manipulates and hurts people. He said he had spent 3 months living a normal life, with normal income and responsibilities. Then he asked if I knew what he discovered. I asked what. He said he was okay, that he did not need $2,400,000 to be happy. He said he did not need his parents' approval or their financial help. He said he did not need a fancy apartment, an expensive car, or anything like that to feel good about himself. His voice became stronger as he spoke. He said that for the first time in his life, he was supporting himself completely. He said he had learned to cook instead of ordering food every night. He walked to work instead of driving. He borrowed books instead of buying everything he wanted. I asked how that felt. He said it felt like he was finally growing up. I leaned back thinking about everything he said. This was not the same person who had stood at my door 3 months ago. This was someone different, but I needed to be sure. I asked what he thought Jorge meant by respect for family values. He thought about it carefully. He said it meant understanding that family is not about what people can do for you, but what you are willing to do for them, even when it is difficult. I asked him for an example. He said it was like the way I took care of him when he was a child, even when his parents were busy. He said I did not do it for money or recognition. I did it because I loved him. Then he said he repaid that love by treating me as if I did not matter when it became inconvenient. His voice changed slightly. He said he could not undo what he had done. He could not take back choosing a dog over me. He could not erase the years he took me for granted. I said that was true. He said he could only promise that if I gave him another chance, he would spend his life proving he had changed. We sat in silence for a while. Outside, the January wind moved against the windows, and I could hear children playing somewhere nearby. Then I spoke. I told him to think carefully before answering. He nodded. I asked if he would still want a relationship with me if I decided he would never receive Jorge's money. He said yes without hesitation. I asked even if it meant disappointing his parents, even if it meant losing $2,400,000. He said yes. I asked why. He said because I was his grandmother. Because I loved him when he did not deserve it, and I was still there even after everything. He said he finally understood that some things matter more than money. He leaned back, clearly tired, and asked if I would consider giving him a chance to prove he had changed, not for the inheritance but for us. I studied his face, looking for any trace of deception or calculation. What I saw instead was vulnerability, hope, and what looked like genuine love. What did you have in mind? Let me take care of you for a while. Not because you need taking care of, but because I want to. Let me come over once a week to help with groceries or yard work or whatever needs doing. Let me learn from you the way I should have been learning all along. And the inheritance? Whatever you decide about that, I'll accept. If you think I've earned it, I'll be grateful. If you don't think I'm ready, I'll keep working on becoming the man Uncle Jorge believed I could be. I looked at this young man who carried my blood, who had broken my heart, and was now asking for the chance to mend it. The transformation wasn't complete. Real change takes time, but the foundation was there. All right, Carlos. We'll try. The relief on his face was so clear that I almost smiled. But, I continued, this isn't about proving yourself for the inheritance. This is about rebuilding our relationship. The money is separate from that. I understand. And if your parents try to interfere, if they pressure you to manipulate me or rush this process, they won't, Carlos said firmly. I haven't spoken to them since October, and I don't plan to until they're ready to treat you with the respect you deserve. Now I did smile. That might be a very long time. Then it's a very long time. As Carlos prepared to leave, he paused at the door. Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Uncle Jorge would be proud of the changes I'm trying to make? I thought about my brother, about his quiet wisdom and his faith in people. I think Jorge would say you're finally becoming the man he always knew you could be. Carlos nodded, tears in his eyes. Then that's enough for now. After he left, I sat in my living room as the winter sun set behind the clouds. For the first time in months, I felt something I hadn't dared to hope for. The possibility that my grandson might actually deserve his inheritance after all. But there was still time left in Jorge's 18-month timeline, and real change would need to be proven through actions, not words. The hardest test was yet to come. The call came early in the morning on a Tuesday in late March. I had been having trouble sleeping, my arthritis acting up with the changing weather, so I was awake when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar, but something about the late hour made me answer. Mrs. Navarro? This is Dr. Rivera from St. Mary's Hospital. Your grandson Carlos asked me to call you. Is he okay? What happened? He's fine, but he's been here all night. There was an accident involving his neighbors, an elderly couple, and Carlos has been staying with them since they were brought in. He asked me to call so you wouldn't worry. I was already reaching for my clothes. What kind of accident? A house fire. They're suffering from smoke inhalation, and the gentleman has some burns on his hands. Carlos saw the smoke from his apartment window, called emergency services, and went into the house to help get them out. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling both fear and pride. I'll be right there. The drive to the hospital felt endless. In the 6 months since Carlos had come back into my life, he had kept his word. He came every Sunday not to ask for anything but simply to spend time with me. He helped me in the garden, showed me how to use my phone, and listened to stories about his childhood. More importantly, I had seen him struggle with real change. I saw him deal with loneliness when he stopped spending money he didn't have. I saw him refuse invitations to stay within his budget. I saw him stay quiet when others mocked his simpler lifestyle. And through all of it, he never once mentioned the inheritance. I found Carlos in the waiting area, still in simple clothes, his hands bandaged, his face marked with smoke. Grandma, he said, standing up. I'm sorry they called you so late. I didn't let him finish. I stepped forward and hugged him. He held me tightly and I could feel him shaking. Tell me what happened. My neighbors, Mr. and Mrs. Chan, they're both in their 80s. I heard her screaming and saw smoke coming from the kitchen. So you called emergency services? Yes, but it was going to take time and I could see she was trapped. I couldn't just wait. Carlos, you could have been killed. I know. But they needed help and I was the only one there. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to them because I was too afraid. A doctor approached us. Your grandson is a hero. He got them out safely. They're going to be fine. After the doctor left, I looked at Carlos. How did you hurt your hands? Chun was trying to go back into the house to save their cat. I had to physically stop him and then go back in myself to find it. You went back into a burning house for a cat? Her name is Mimi. She's been their companion for 12 years. Mr. Chun was willing to risk his life for her, and I couldn't let him do that. Did you find her? Carlos smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. She was hiding under their bed, scared but unharmed. The fire department had arrived by then, and they helped me get her out safely. I stared at my grandson, seeing him with new eyes. This wasn't the young man who had demanded I apologize to his dog 18 months ago. This was someone who risked his life for elderly neighbors and their pet, who stayed at the hospital all night to make sure they were okay, who thought to call his grandmother so she wouldn't worry. Carlos, I said quietly, do you remember what you said to me the day Jorge's inheritance was revealed? About wanting to become the man he believed you could be? Carlos nodded. Tonight you became that man. We spent the rest of the night at the hospital. Carlos refused to leave until he was certain the Chens were stable, and I refused to leave him. As the sun came up, painting the waiting room in soft colors, I made a decision that had been building in my heart for months. Carlos, I need to tell you something. He looked at me, exhaustion visible on his face. Jorge's conditions for the inheritance were never really about financial responsibility, or even respect for family values, though those things matter. Carlos frowned. What do you mean? I pulled out my phone and showed him a photo I had taken months ago, a picture of a letter Jorge had written to me, separate from his will. Your uncle was worried that you might never learn to think about anyone but yourself. He was afraid that without consequences, you would become a person who takes everything and gives nothing back. Carlos read the letter slowly, his expression changing as he took in Jorge's words about character, selflessness, and doing what is right even when it is difficult. The inheritance was never about proving yourself to me. It was about proving yourself to yourself. Jorge wanted you to discover who you really were when no one was watching, when there was nothing to gain from doing the right thing. And tonight, when you ran into a burning house to save two elderly neighbors you barely knew, when you stayed here all night to make sure they were okay, when you called me so I wouldn't worry, that's when you proved you had become the man Jorge always hoped you could be. Carlos was quiet for a long moment. So, I've met his conditions? You've exceeded them. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope I had been carrying for weeks, waiting for the right moment. This contains all the paperwork necessary to release Jorge's inheritance to you. $2,400,000. Managed through a trust that will give you access to it gradually as you continue to show good judgment. Carlos took the envelope but didn't open it. He asked if he could ask me something. Of course. If none of this had happened, if there had never been an inheritance, do you think we would have found our way back to each other? It was a question I had been asking myself for months. I said I didn't know, but I hoped we would have. The person he was tonight had always been inside him. He just needed to find it. Carlos set the envelope down beside him. He said he wanted to do something with the money that Jorge would be proud of. I asked what. He said he wanted to create a fund to help elderly people afford safety improvements, smoke detectors, fire extinguishers, emergency systems. He said that if Mr. and Mrs. Chun had better protection, that night might not have happened. I felt tears in my eyes. I said Jorge would have loved that. He added that he wanted to buy a house. Not something expensive, just a place where I would always have a room if I ever chose not to live alone. That surprised me. I told him I was fine living on my own. He said he knew, but that taking care of family is not about waiting until help is needed. It is about making sure no one ever feels alone. As we sat there, watching the hospital come to life for the morning shift, I thought about everything that had brought us to that moment. 18 months ago, I had been the disposable grandmother. Now I was sitting next to a young man who had risked his life for strangers, and was thinking about how to give back. I told him there was something he needed to understand about that night. He asked what. I told him that when he ran into that burning house, he was not only saving the Chens, he was saving himself. He was becoming the person he was meant to be. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. And when he chose to stay all night, when he made sure I would not worry, when he put others before himself, that was when he proved that love is not about what you receive. It is about what you are willing to give. 3 hours later, we left the hospital together. Mr. and Mrs. Chun were going to stay with their daughter while their home was repaired, and Mimi would go with them. They insisted on thanking Carlos before leaving. Mrs. Chun hugged him, crying, and Mr. Chun joked about naming their next cat after him. As we walked to our cars, Carlos paused and looked back at the hospital. He said something felt strange. He said that this was the best he had felt about himself in years, and that it had nothing to do with money or success or what anyone else thought of him. I told him that was not strange, that it was growth. 6 months later, I stood in the backyard of Carlos's new house, watching him teach the Chen's great-grandson how to plant tomatoes. The little boy was 4 years old, the same age Carlos had been when he first helped me in my garden all those years ago. The house was modest but comfortable, with a beautiful guest suite that Carlos had designed especially for me. I had not moved in. I was still enjoying my independence, but I visited often, and I knew that when the time came, I would have a loving home waiting for me. Carlos's Foundation for Elderly Home Safety had already helped over 300 families, and he had become well known in the community for his work. But what made me proudest was not the recognition. It was the quiet way he checked on the Chens, the patience he showed with their great-grandson, and the respect he had finally learned to show the people who had always loved him. Elena and Mateo eventually tried to rebuild their relationship with Carlos, once they realized he would inherit Jorge's money. But Carlos set firm boundaries, making it clear that things would only continue if they treated me with respect, and stopped trying to control everything for their own benefit. It took them several months to accept that, but eventually they did. Perhaps they changed because they hoped for future grandchildren, or perhaps they finally saw that their son had become someone worth respecting. Either way, our family dinners became much more peaceful. As the sun set behind Carlos's house, coloring the sky in shades of orange and pink, I thought about Jorge and how wisely he had arranged everything. He understood that money without character means nothing, but character without testing is only potential. Carlos had been tested, and he proved himself worthy, not only of the inheritance, but of the love and respect that had always been there for him. The little Chun boy called me over to help them plant. I walked toward Carlos, who was kneeling in the soil, his hands covered in dirt, his face calm in a way I had not seen since he was very young. I asked what they were planting. He said basil and smiled, adding that he wanted me to teach him how to make that pasta sauce from his childhood, the one he had never appreciated enough back then. I knelt beside them, my 68-year-old knees reminding me of my age, and told him I would gladly teach him, but only if he promised to pass the recipe on to someone he loved. He looked at the little boy, then back at me, and said he promised. And in that moment, surrounded by the scent of fresh earth and growing plants, I understood that Jorge's legacy was safe. Not just the money, but the values behind it. Love, sacrifice, and the truth that the most important things in life cannot be bought, they must be earned. Now I wonder about you who listened to this story. What would you have done in my place, and have you ever faced something similar in your life? Share your thoughts below. And I will leave a couple of other stories for you on the final screen that might also surprise you. Thank you for staying until the end.